Hello, hi. Welcome to the Linnean Society to our lunchtime lecture. My name is Leanne Melbourne and I am the Events and Communications Manager here at the Society. Firstly, we're not expecting the fire alarms to go off, but if they do, please exit the way you came, turn right to Piccadilly, and then right again into Burlington Arcade and wait there while we make sure that everyone is out of the building. Toilets are downstairs. So today, it's quite loud. For today's lunchtime lecture, we have Dr. David Button talking about putting flesh on ancient bones. David is a postdoctoral researcher at the Natural History Museum in London. Previous to this, he has had postdoctoral roles at the North Carolina State University and the University of Birmingham. David completed his PhD thesis on cranial biomechanics of sauropod and prosauropod dinosaurs at the University of Bristol in the Paleobiology Research Group. He's interested in the evolution of feeding behavior in animals, particularly within herbivorous dinosaurs. David has done radio interviews and written many news articles. I recommend the one on the Natural History Museum website where he analyses what's wrong and right with Jurassic World 2. Today, David will be discussing how researchers use CT scanning and digital approaches to study the feeding behavior in early dinosaurs and analyse how this is related to the diversification and ecological dominance of the group. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Okay, that's the time to do it now. Okay, good. Yeah, so as Leanne said, I'm here today to talk to you guys a bit about the early history of dinosaurs and the ways in which me and some of my collaborators are currently working on investigating what was going on in that very important time in Earth's history. So, we're all used to seeing lots of pictures of how varied and diverse dinosaurs were. So whether that be fossil dinosaurs, such as these ones here, which are very much icons of paleontology, or even the living dinosaurs around us today, the birds. And we see like this massive range of diversity with over 9,000 living species. So, it's really interesting to look at this sort of thing. And so indeed, generally, when people look at dinosaurs, so here we have like a sort of family tree of the dinosaurs here through time. And generally, when people think about dinosaurs and their range of habits, you either think about birds or we think about some of these things here. So these big horned dinosaurs and meat-eating dinosaurs and very big dinosaurs from like this end of the tree from later on in the dinosaurs' history. But if we really want to understand how this diversity was assembled and where these dinosaurs came from, then what we should be looking at is this part here, the very sort of early history of dinosaurs, through from the late Triassic, starting about 235 million years ago, through into the early Jurassic until about 185 million years ago. So currently I'm working with some collaborators at the Natural History Museum and then also at University College London to work out what was going on in this critical phase which allowed all of this later stuff to happen. So if we look for fossils of the very earliest dinosaurs and their relatives, we mostly have to look to the southern hemisphere. So the earliest sort of putative dinosaurs that we see are things like this animal here, Nyasasaurus, which is about nearly 245 million years old and comes from Tanzania in Africa. And like the earliest definitive dinosaurs are things like Eoraptor here, which is like 230 million years old and is known from Argentina. But we do also see some of the relatives of dinosaurs from other places in the globe. So, for example, these animals here are things called Silesaurids, and we think they're some of the closest relatives of dinosaurs. And they sort of live around up to nearly sort of 250 million years old and are known from across various places across the globe. And in fact, we even have some early dinosaur relatives from the UK. So these are the legs and the tail and the spine of an animal called Saltopus, which is sort of a rabbit-sized reptile from Scotland. And these things together show us that the earliest relatives of dinosaurs were probably sort of around 255 million years old, so we think that's when dinosaurs originated. And although these were very widespread, we also think that dinosaurs originated in the southern hemisphere. But anyway, so we have very early dinosaurs like Eoraptor here, right at the back of the Triassic. And these early things are quite difficult for us to understand. So for example, you can see here, like Eoraptor, we don't really know necessarily where it fits in the dinosaur tree. And those of you who've been keeping an eye on the news will also know the dinosaur tree's been changing quite a lot recently. And that's because these fossils are somewhat hard to work with, as we'll see later. And so it's quite tempting to think we're used to dinosaurs being top dog, we're used to being massive and in charge. And so you might think, oh, as soon as dinosaurs appeared, were they already like this? But the thing is, not really. If we look at the earliest dinosaurs, like things like Eoraptor here, and then Panphagia here, which is an early member of this group, which I'll come on to in a second. They were actually quite rare, and they were small, about the size of a cat, and they seem to have been somewhat ephemeral in the communities in which they lived. And instead, these places are dominated by all these sort of critters here. So we have these here are dicynodonts. They're early relatives of mammals, and they could get up to around the size, even to an ox to an elephant in size, and they were like the main herbivores of the day. We have these dog-like cynodonts here, which were early relatives of mammals. And then we have a variety of animals here, which are more closely related to crocodiles than they are to living dinosaurs. So we have these Rauisuchians here, which were large terrestrial predators. They were very much at the top of the food chain. So the very earliest dinosaurs were kind of stuck out on the side and playing second fiddle to all these other things. The first dinosaurs that really had a go at fighting back, as it were the Herrerasaurids. And we can see them here at Darcy Tree. And this is Herrerasaurus, one of the Herrerasaurids here. And these were a bit bigger. They got up to about 3 meters in length. And we think these would have been important carnivores in the communities in which they lived. But still, if we sort of summarize those still, at this sort of time, around sort of 230 to around 225 million years ago, dinosaurs were still mostly small. They were quite rare, and they're only known from a few localities. They're not particularly important. However, if we then go sort of through later in the Triassic, sort of after 230 million years ago, we start seeing the diversification of more dinosaurs. So this group in blue here, within this range here, this group is called the Sauropodomorpha. And this included the giant long-necked sauropods like Diplodocus, but also their early ancestors. So here we're talking about their early ancestors. And some of those, like this animal here, Pantydraco, which is known from Wales, was small. It was like Eoraptor and the other dinosaurs we saw before. It was about the size of a cat or like a rabbit or something. It was only up to maybe like 11 kilograms in weight. But within the later part of the Triassic, we also see the some diversification of other sauropodomorphs that got a lot bigger. So, for example, this is Plateosaurus that we're lucky enough to know from many nearly complete skeletons from Europe. So we've got a good idea of what this animal looked like, and we know it could reach 9 meters long and nearly 900 kilograms in weight. And in fact, at the end of the Triassic, we even had some early sauropodomorphs like Ingentia here, which got to around 10 tons in weight, which meant at that point it was the biggest animal that had ever lived. So what we really see in this latter half of the late Triassic is we see sauropodomorphs started to become quite important. They're diversifying to a lot of different species, and they seem to have filled the role of the large herbivore in many communities across the globe. What we also see is we start to see the diversification of the theropods. So that is the two-legged, mostly meat-eating dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor and so on, although those came much later. And these start to be known again around the same time as sauropodomorphs, and again, in certain places, these are very well known. So this is a skeleton of an animal called Coelophysis, which is known from hundreds of skeletons preserved together in the USA. So again, we think that this thing lived in sort of large flocks or herds. It was like a fairly lightweight, kind of 3 meters long predator of small animals. And we see animals a bit like Coelophysis in other parts of the globe in the late Triassic and early Jurassic as well, in Africa, and as we go into the Jurassic, also in North America still, and in China. But as we'll come back to later, it's not necessarily clear how diverse these things are, because they all look quite similar, and it's difficult to untangle whether there are lots of different species, or was Coelophysis itself just spreading out very far. Because an important thing to remember, which I should have mentioned earlier really, is back then in the Triassic, all the continents of the Earth were congealed together into Pangaea, so animals could theoretically spread very far. So again, we see that we have these theropods being present, sometimes in large numbers, and in particular places like Triassic, they even start to get to large sizes. So this is Zoopesaurus from Argentina and Lilian sternus from Argentina, and these were both quite large predators. They could reach about 5 meters long, and they could be up to nearly 200 kilograms in weight. So that's significantly heavier than I am even. So we can see again that these things are starting to diversify, and locally they seem to have been potentially quite important and quite abundant. But on the global scale, they're still not particularly important. There still is those early crocodile relatives and early mammal relatives really ruling the roost in many other parts of the globe. So essentially we have the circumstance where in some areas we'll have things with like prosauropod dinosaurs and early theropod dinosaurs, and so you'd have the same kinds of, starting to see the kinds of communities we'd see for the rest of the Mesozoic, with dinosaurs filling these various roles. But in many other places still, the dinosaurs are a relatively small part and less important than these early relatives of crocodiles here, like aetosaurs and phytosaurs. And it's interesting to wonder, why might this be, why we start to see this separation? And in fact, we can see an interesting pattern emerge with climate. So as I was saying earlier, in the Triassic, the continents of the Earth were congealed together into Pangaea, although they started to break up at the end of the period. And this led to a very different climate than the one we see today. So in general, this temperature gradient was less steep, so the temperature was more equable across the continent. But the lack of seas in the way led to very different weather. So in particular, there seems to be strong latitudinal zonation of precipitation. So we have relatively humid conditions at higher latitudes, and that's where we get more of these dinosaurs. And then in the center of the continent, things were much, much drier. And so it's been suggested that dinosaurs, which may have had a higher metabolism than other reptiles, had greater energy needs, and so had to live in these more humid environments where there's more vegetation for them to feed on. But that's something which we'll come back to later. So this is like the way we have things in the Triassic. So essentially, you have dinosaurs starting to diversify. We're starting to see a range of different dinosaurs, and locally they can be quite abundant and significant. But on the larger scale, they're still not the predominant animals on land. But when we switch into the early Jurassic, we see things start to change. So here we're into the early Jurassic here, and sauropodomorphs are still very, very important, but in particular, the prosauropods are now the most abundant large-bodied herbivores across many, many parts of the globe. They're everywhere. So that includes things like Lufengosaurus here from China, which is still quite high latitude, but we also start to get them from more deserty environments as well. So they're not just limited to these more humid forests anymore, they're everywhere. And then as we get through into like the end of the later in the early Jurassic, we also see the evolution of the earliest sauropods proper. So these are the large, long-necked dinosaurs routinely weighing over 10 tons. So in this phase in the early Jurassic, we go from the Triassic communities we talked about before to all of a sudden these sauropodomorphs are everywhere, and we're seeing the establishment of the groups that would come to dominate the rest of the Mesozoic. And if we look into theropods, we see the same signal. Before, if you remember, things like Coelophysis were the most common things. They were quite small, and they were still around in the early Jurassic. But much larger theropods started to become common as well. So this is an animal from North America called Dilophosaurus, and it was about 6 meters long. It was a large carnivore. And this is an even larger carnivore, like 7 meters long, Cryolophosaurus from Antarctica, with some other prosauropods in the back. So in the early Jurassic, we can already see that now theropods are the dominant carnivores on land, like sauropodomorphs, the dominant plant eaters, and they've both spread to every continent. So we can see here again this sudden shake-up in fortunes. And so we see these kinds of scenes of dinosaurs fighting each other, which we then continue to see for the rest of the Jurassic and through into the Cretaceous. Now, the other main group of dinosaurs, the ornithischians, or bird-tipped dinosaurs up here, although unhelpfully they're not the ones to evolve into birds, they were the theropods. These are one of the main groups of plant-eating dinosaurs, and we haven't spoken about those very much yet, and that's because their early fossil record is quite lacking. So we used to think that we had some early remains of ornithischian dinosaurs from the Triassic, but those now mostly seem to have not actually been from dinosaurs, but from related animals. So the first good evidence we have of ornithischians is in the early Jurassic. And then we see a variety of things. We see animals like Lizothosaurus here, which is like this small, fast-moving animal, from Africa, but then also from Africa we see several, and South America, we see several species of these things called heterodontosaurs. And although these were very early ornithischians, they're already quite specialized. So you can see, you might be able to see here, they had these large fangs, and unlike most reptiles, they had different kinds of teeth, a bit like we do, which we'll come back to in a bit. They had a beak, and they had these large fangs, and then these chewing teeth at the back of the mouth. And these guys also have beaks too, so we think this means that they were plant eaters, although again, we'll come back to that. And then further on in the early Jurassic, they have the evolution of other kinds of ornithischians, like armored dinosaurs. This is a Scelidosaurus, an early armored dinosaur which is known from the UK. And so this is a specimen here which was found in the south of the UK, and you can see It's covered in this armor, and so we see the Ornithischians in the early Jurassic start to experiment with these different body types and armor as well. And later on in the Jurassic, you'd see the evolution of all the different Ornithischian groups as well. So this diversity means we think they must have originated in the Triassic, but the fact that their record is quite poor suggests that they were very rare. So if we think about what we've got from dinosaurs in the early Triassic, in the late Triassic through early Jurassic, the summary. And essentially, we can think of it was in three main phases. So the first phase is their origination. Dinosaurs first appeared sort of around 245 billion years ago, but they remained very rare until a bit after 230 billion years ago. And this time, they were probably limited to the southern hemisphere, mostly sort of in South America. And they're rare, and they're not particularly specialized. Apart from the Herrerasaurids, the other guys seem to be quite little sort of jack-of-all-trades things on the sides of communities, although, again, we'll come back to that. Then, for the rest of the late Triassic, we see the second phase of diversification. And that's where we start to see the establishment of more species and body plans and ecologies, and particularly the prosauropods in particular, but also the theropods to a lesser extent, were locally abundant and very significant, but they still did not dominate the majority of communities on the land. And the Ornithischians, we don't really have any particularly good evidence from this time. But then part 3 in the Jurassic is when we see the takeover, when dinosaurs of all these three main groups became the predominant large-bodied animals all across the globe, from the UK right down through into Antarctica. So we've got the first good evidence of Ornithischians, and in fact we see all the major dinosaur groups that would come to dominate the rest of the Mesozoic being established. So how can we explain this pattern? What changed? So loads of people have thought about what led to the success of the dinosaurs. It's a very popular thing. And historically, a popular suggestion was that just over a gradual period of time, the dinosaurs, which were superior in some way, had outcompeted all these other animals around at the same time. And this is often based upon the thought, like an evolutionary principle of key innovations. That is, what did dinosaurs have, which meant that they were able to outcompete everything else? And so a classic suggestion of this was some feature of their anatomy, presumably. A classic suggestion of this was their posture, which is talked about a lot in sort of the 60s through the 70s. And so, as I'm sure most people already know, whereas most reptiles have sprawling limbs like modern lizards, dinosaurs had an erect posture like modern mammals. And so it was suggested that, okay, dinosaurs had this erect posture that made them more agile, it made them quicker, they were able to outcompete all the other reptiles of the day. And this led to their success. However, many of the other reptiles of the time, like the crocodile relatives and those sort of things, also had an erect stance. So that was somewhat different and probably would have meant they were less agile. So this sheds potentially some doubt on this. But another suggestion of what made dinosaurs so successful was their metabolism. So today, animals tend to be ranked into, we can sort them into cold-blooded animals, like modern reptiles here, and warm-blooded animals, like mammals and birds. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there's been lots of controversy over the years as to what exactly the metabolism of dinosaurs was like. Was it more like that of modern reptiles, including their crocodilian relatives, or was it more like their modern descendants, the birds? And it seems in general that most dinosaurs would have had a metabolic rate above that of reptiles, but potentially below, most of them probably had it below that of modern mammals and birds. But still, this has led to suggestions that this increased metabolic rate would have allowed them to outcompete other reptiles, which is how they then came to predominate things in the Jurassic. And then, as we saw before, that would have also meant they need more energy, and so potentially that restricted them in the environments they could occupy during the Triassic. And this is fine, except this sort of pattern doesn't really gel with what we now understand about the dinosaur fossil record. So in particular, the way we see these phases of instead of dinosaurs gradually outcompeting things, we see this phased appearance, then diversification, then predominance, suggests there might be some external driver that dinosaurs were able to opportunistically take advantage of. So this is quite a complicated thing here, but we're only going to have to take a little bit from it. But essentially, if you look here, this is a geological section up through the middle Triassic and then through into the late Triassic. And these are the geological units we see here. And these blue sections here are something called pluvial episodes. And this is in the late Triassic, we start to see changes in the climate, where we'll see, apparently on a global scale, cycles of where the climate go from semi-arid to humid to arid to semi-arid again. So we see these wettening events and drying events. And this led to extinctions in the plant floras, which were important at the time, which led to extinctions of some of the herbivores that fed on those plants, and then in turn the extinctions of the carnivores that fed on those herbivores. And so it's been suggested that the dinosaurs instead, because these kind of correspond to where we see those phases of dinosaur evolution, it's been suggested that dinosaurs opportunistically took advantage of these, of the clearing out of these odd animals to take over the niches that these animals used to fill. And particularly notable here is at the end of the Triassic, we see a mass extinction. So it's probably resulted in extreme volcanism, which would have led to global warming and other modifications of the Earth's climate through the release of gases. And this led to the extinction of potentially as much as 70% of life in both the sea and on land. And again, that killed off these older crocodile relatives and these older mammal relatives. So then in the early Jurassic, you have this clearing out of ecological niches that the dinosaurs are then able to exploit and which allows them to diversify. And so in recent years, this sort of opportunistic model has become more popular, where it kind of also gels more with our understanding of evolution, and that we think long-term competitive events don't really happen in evolution so much as extrinsic things like climate and changes in continents and mass extinctions result in changes that animals then respond to. And this is kind of shown, so these plots here, so this one here is diversity, so that's just a number of species, and this is something called disparity, and that's just if we measure how varied body shapes were. So if you think about it, diversity would be if you had 3 species of cats, your diversity would be 3. But disparity would be if you have 3 species of cats, it would be low, but if you had a cat, a rabbit, and an iguana, it would be high because you have a greater variety of body forms there. And if we compare these tracks, this kind of fits in this opportunistic model because we can see that this side here is during the Triassic. We see that these are the crocodile relatives, and we see that they have higher disparity than dinosaurs. But then in the early Jurassic, they swap round. The dinosaurs are more, suggesting they're taking over more ecological niches, and the crocodiles plummet after a lot of them go extinct in the end Triassic mass extinction. But there's a bit of a sting in all this, in that as we increasingly understand the relationships of dinosaurs better, serious dinosaurs, some of their ancestors, we start to see that this pattern doesn't quite hold because the dinosaurs and their relatives were probably nearly as equally as diverse as crocodiles and their relatives during the Triassic. So what we have here is quite a complicated picture. It's difficult to disentangle exactly what's going on here. And that's where I'm now currently looking at. So I'm working in collaboration with Paul Barrett at the Natural History Museum, and then Mark Jones and Laura Porro, who's actually right there, from University College London, to try to understand this in more detail, to get down and really look at what is it that underpinned the diversification of the dinosaurs, and then how the different body plans of dinosaurs were established in this critical phase of early dinosaur evolution. And if we're to disentangle these alternatives for how dinosaurs diversified in the late Triassic through early Jurassic, what we really need is a window into their ecology. Unfortunately, dinosaurs preserve such a window, which is their mouth. If we could understand what an animal fed, we could understand a significant part of its life and get to think about the different ecological niches it would have had. And understanding what animals ate and fossil animals ate can be easy or difficult depending. Sometimes you're very lucky and you'll have a very well-preserved skull, so you have a good idea what an animal looked like, what it ate, and what its capabilities were. But sometimes you'll have stuff that is pancaked. And unfortunately, a lot of, not only are Triassic dinosaur fossils for the most part quite rare, they're also often very scrappy or squashed or deformed, which makes it difficult for us to understand them, which leads to many of the gaps in our understanding of their ecology, but also of their relationships. So what we do to look at this is we CT scan the cranium of dinosaurs. So here we can see this is Plateosaurus, early sauropodomorph. So we CT scan those through. And that allows us then to reconstruct the bones of these things in a virtual environment. And this is useful, that we can share this with our colleagues, we can look at it from all angles and think, well, what's the palate like, and that sort of thing, and even look at like the replacement teeth, other internal structures. But then it also allows us to repair the bones for the damages of the fossil records. We can fill in holes, we can restore missing elements, we can correct bending and warpage, and so this gives us then an idea of what the skull was like when the animal was alive. And this is much more useful because it gives us far more information about its lifestyle. But what we can even do then is we can look at scars and other features of the bone and reconstruct the muscles, in this case of the jaw system. And by getting the muscles down, we can really start to understand the capabilities of these things. How hard could they bite? What kind of jaw actions they could perform? And so we're taking these methods at the moment to look at the evolution of the skull in early dinosaurs and what this would have meant for what they could eat. And there are some other advantages to this as well, like some more classic paleontology advantages. So this is a relative of Coelophysis, well, potentially Coelophysis from itself, from the early Jurassic. And remember I was saying earlier that there was a lot of confusion with these early theropods as to exactly how diverse they were. Well, this is a problem here. So this is the skull from this creature here called Megapnosaurus kentake. And it had been suggested, based upon features such as these little holes in the skull here, that this wasn't just a species of Coelophysis, it was its own separate genus, which would have ramifications for how we think about how early theropods diversified. However, as you can see, because the skull is warped, it wasn't clear whether some of these features were genuine or whether they have artificial consequences of the fossil record. So we were able to reconstruct this thing in 3D and repair this damage, and we can see that these two holes here and various other features are actually genuine features. They're not merely damage that has occurred to the fossil during fossilization. So this helps them to support that this was a separate genus and gives us a better idea about how diverse these early dinosaur communities were. But more interestingly, I think, it also allows us to really get down upon the cranial anatomy of these things and what's meant for capabilities. So just as a quick review here, for our early dinosaur tree as earlier, we can look at the skull. We've been looking at the skulls of early Herrerasaurs, like Herrerasaurus here, and you can see that it's got these very large recurved teeth and it's quite boxy skull, which shows that it would have been quite capable of taking large prey. So it seems that we have sort of large predators all the way back there in dinosaur evolution. We have here a series of different sauropodimorph taxa, so that's just the big sauropods, like Plateosaurus, and these things Adiapapasaurus, and then Melaronosaurus, which is very close to the origin of sauropods itself. And here we can see they have these more generalized skulls, but leaf-shaped teeth, potentially suggestive of herbivory, but we'll come back to that. We have early theropods, like Coelophysis has been talking about, which even quite early on seem to show obvious adaptations for carnivory, like these long recurved teeth and this hooked snout. So again, we can be fairly robust at thinking these things were carnivorous, but again, and then we have, within ornithischians, we have quite a diversity of things even within the early Jurassic. So the early Amodontosaurus Scelidosaurus, like leaf-shaped teeth here, similar to those of sauropodomorphs, again, suggestive of herbivory. Similar to Lizothosaurus. But with Heterodontosaurus, I was mentioning earlier, we see both the evolution of a beak, but also these fangs and these large grinding teeth, potentially suggestive of feeding upon quite tough plant matter. So if we just sort of compare the diversity of skull forms we see, even within these early dinosaurs, this suggests that they were radiating into lots of different niches very early on in their history. So although they weren't necessarily important, they were establishing the roots for their future diversification that far back. So that's fine. However, it complicates, this is complicated by the fact that all we've done so far is we've just compared what the skulls look like and their gross anatomy. And gross anatomy is not necessarily a good predictor for how animals actually perform. So we have lots of examples from working on living animals where even animals whose skulls or other bones might look quite similar actually do things very, very differently. And so for this, what we're doing is we're utilizing biomechanical techniques to investigate and really the performance of the skulls of each of these things. So to work out really how hard they could bite, what actions they could perform, what that might then mean for their diet, and also what that means about the evolution of the ground plans in each of these groups. So what we do here, so looking at here, this is just an example from Plateosaurus, that sauropod I've been talking quite a lot about. We can see here, we can reconstruct the different jaw muscles, so we can compare it to other dinosaurs and then also its other relatives to see how those jaw muscles might vary over time. And if we reconstruct the jaw muscles, we can get an idea of how hard it would bite, which doesn't necessarily mean much in isolation, but if we compare it to other dinosaurs, it's useful. And here it's actually quite similar to those of living herbivores. But then also what we can do is we can perform techniques such as finite element analysis. So finite element analysis is an engineering technique where essentially you take a complex structure like this, like a skull, and you break it down into millions of simple elements. And you then can impose forces on those, such as from the jaw muscles, to simulate a behavior such as feeding. And that will then reconstruct the stress and strain in the bones. So here the stress is shown, hotter colours here mean higher stress. And this can help us to identify what kind of behavior, if we simulate different behaviors, what kind of behaviors the animal could perform. And then it also helps us to test significance of individual features and innovations we might see in the groups. If we see a feature and think, so for example, in sauropod evolution, we see the development of something called the lateral plate, which is a growth of bone over the teeth. And people are like, that might have been for bracing the teeth against the forces from stripping leaves. But with FEA, we can actually test that. We can add it to models, we can remove it to models, and see what impact it has. And we're also working on some living animals as well to help ground this. So this is some work that one of my colleagues has headed looking at a pigeon. So this is a simple feral pigeon. But you can see here we soaked it in an iodine solution so we could then CT scan it and bring up all the various soft tissues like the brain and the eye. But in particular, it's helped us to clarify the muscles of the pigeon. And we can then project these data back to help us understand the muscles of fossil dinosaurs too. So this sort of thing's a work in progress at the minute, but I'm talking here some stuff specifically about the evolution of sauropodomorphs, because that's the kind of thing that I've worked on before. But we're now expanding these methods to cover the other dinosaur groups. And so we have the Platysaurus up here, and we can compare it to some later sauropods as well. And so why we're doing this is that you see the evolution of various characters through this tree. And because these guys were fully herbivorous, we think that those characters were related to the pressures of herbivory. But we wanted to test that using this method here. So what we can see is through the evolution of the group, we see increased bite forces and also just increased strength of the skull. It's more robust. And that's consistent with like these sauropods feeding on quite heavy, bulky plant matter. But why does the skull of Platysaurus perform more poorly if it was eating a similar diet to these things? Well, you can see here that lots of the regions of higher stress, the skull of Platysaurus, are in the ramus of the jaw and in the bridge of the snout here. And so they're all weaknesses as a result of having a long, elongate snout. And these later fully herbivorous sauropods truncate the snout to avoid some of these problems. So why do we have these mechanical compromises in Platysaurus? Well, an elongated snout is important because it allows you to bite more quickly, which is important if you ever want to catch prey. And also it allows Platysaurus to fit in more and more varied teeth along the jaw, which might allow it to tackle different tasks. So what these evidence suggests is that these early prosauropods, like Platysaurus and Massospondylus, were probably omnivorous rather than strictly herbivorous. Because although we do see adaptations for herbivory in the skull, we also see mechanical compromises towards occasional consumption of animal matter. So, if we then take these things to kind of wrap up, we can see that early dinosaur evolution is pulsed. It sort of occurs in three main phases. So we see the early origination of the dinosaurs between about 245 and 230 billion years ago. So when they first appear, but in this time they're quite rare and they're mostly somewhat tangential in communities. Then, however, we start to see the diversification and local abundance of the group later in the Triassic, and then we see them really expand heavily through into the Jurassic, and they continue to go and diversify in there. And many parts of the Odorsal fossil record remain uncertain due to the nature of the remains, but CT scanning helps us tunnel into this and understand early dinosaurs in more detail than ever before. And we can see here there's lots of diversity in cranial anatomy in these early things, and this might lead us to suggest that the radiation of dinosaurs might then be what we'd call an adaptive radiation. So the dinosaurs are expanding out after the extinction of other taxa to occupy all these new niches, leading to the evolution of more species. But however, this needs further testing, which is what we're doing now with the biomechanical methods, because from anatomy alone, we can't necessarily reconstruct what an animal actually did, and biomechanical modeling like FEA is crucial in understanding this in more detail. So I haven't talked as much about early Ornithischians theropods today because I wanted to, but we didn't really have stuff ready to come and show you guys, which is a shame. But they seem to have both been quite specialized relatively early on in their history. With Ornithischians, that might be because we're missing the earliest forms, but certainly with theropods, even quite early diverging stuff seems to become carnivorous quite quickly. However, within early sauropodomorphs, although they show some specializations towards herbivory, they still show a more generalized skull performance, suggesting they might have been more omnivorous and perhaps broader in their diet. And this may be responsible for why sauropodomorphs diversified before the other dinosaur groups in the more unpredictable climates of the late Triassic, before then diversifying out into obligate herbivores within the Jurassic itself. So as is very much ongoing, and as we get more results from these other parts, we should then build up a bigger picture as to exactly the dynamics of early dinosaur evolution. So that leaves me to thank my collaborators on this project, so Paul Barrett at the NHM, and Lauren Porrow and Mark Jones at UCL, and NERC, who funded this project, and also some of my previous collaborators on some of the sauropodomorph stuff, Emily Rayfield at the University of Bristol. And I thank, of course, all of you for coming.